No worries if not. Just curious. I'll ask again at the end of class. Maybe you'll think of something. All right. Well, last week we spent a lot of time looking at Jesus the teacher, right? So Jesus spent most of Mark 4 teaching, and he taught in a very specific way. He started teaching using what? Parables, right? We said parables were earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And Jesus taught in parables, that we talked about last week, in one sense, to contextualize his message, to make it understandable for his followers, but also to kind of hide it or to kind of withhold it from others as a form of judgment. Specifically, we're talking about the Jews or Israel. And then right at the end of the text where Jesus taught about the kingdom through this series of parables, we see Jesus get in the boat with the disciples, and they're going to leave the area, they're going to cross the sea, and as they're going, they're caught in a major storm, and they're panicked, the disciples are panicked, and the disciples are terrified, and they're frightened, and they're doing everything they can to literally right the ship. Meanwhile, Jesus is what? Sleeping. He's asleep, right? So in their panic, they wake Jesus up, which we talked about last week is not the wrong. They're not wrong in doing that. Their wrong question was, "Do you not care about us?" Which is why they end up getting rebuked. So Jesus wakes up, he rebukes the storm, he calms it, and then as we mentioned, once he's done rebuking the storm, he rebukes the disciples. They wake him up with the question, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" And I kind of shared last week that I thought, in my pride, thinking that I know better than the folks who designed our Bibles, I thought this section would be better in chapter 5 than chapter 4. And the more I've thought about it this week, the more I think, I think I'm wrong. That this is very clearly a transitional event. We've talked a lot about how Mark's original audience, those who are going to read this letter for the first time, were going to be those persecuted Christians in Rome. That's his audience, but his perspective is coming from where? From who?
The other disciples.
Yeah, so he's writing from Peter and the other disciples' perspective, primarily Peter. So the lens through which we see a lot of our stories and a lot of what we read in Mark is from the disciples' perspective. And that's what we kind of, I think, get what we get here. And Matthew and Luke don't necessarily record some of the same things around some of these stories, but he's getting this story from Peter who's, and as you read Mark chapter 5, you get this sense of someone kind of looking back, trying to tell and put into words some amazing things that they had just seen. And that's kind of how we see Mark record this. And as he does so, he does focus a lot on the disciples. The 12 disciples specifically that we looked at last week, or may have been the week before actually. And from that perspective, we kind of get this lens. And Jesus is kind of, we talked about a little bit last week about how the parables, we kind of get to see the parable of the sower and some of these other parables unfold in the lives of the disciples. That the word is being planted in them, but we're not sure quite how it's hitting. And Jesus kind of lets us know right here that they're not quite yet where they need to be, because they're called to be the 12 apostles a few verses ago before we are now. And that means they're going to be sent, and Jesus said they're going to have a ministry. But when you get to Mark 4 at the end, it's like, well, it doesn't seem like they're quite ready for ministry. And that's kind of as Jesus rebukes them and asks, "Why are you so afraid, and have you still no faith?" That kind of leads us into Mark chapter 5, where the lens is almost focusing in on the disciples in these 3 stories that we have, kind of boom, 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 that are going to firm the disciples' faith. The big lingering question that kind of starts this whole section, I'm just going to paraphrase what the disciples were thinking after Jesus calmed the storm, right? I mean, this is what they ask: "Who is this?" So they've been with Jesus, they've heard his teaching, but it hasn't quite taken root yet. Like this is what's lingering over chapter 5. As we get into chapter 5, the question is, who is this? And Jesus is going to go to great lengths to show him who he is. So, we get to Mark chapter 5. And I think, while you wouldn't necessarily put the end of chapter 4 in with chapter 5, they are, in Mark chapter 4, the end there is kind of this first demonstrative miracle that Jesus performs over this span of about 50 verses, according to Mark. And we get to see Jesus exercise his authority in a way that's very, very unique, right? And kind of gives us insight into who he is and who he wants the disciples to know he is, in a way that eradicates their fear and opens their faith. So, he's going to spend chapter 5 showing us that, yes, Jesus in chapter 4, this is Jesus the teacher, but lest you think he's just a teacher, let me show you something here in chapter 5. So in Mark 5, 1 through 20, we get the healing of the demoniac. And off the jump, we want to know that there's some controversy around where this event took place. If you open up your Bibles to Matthew or Mark or Luke, you might get different readings on whether it says the Gerasene demoniac, or if there's another, you may say Gerasa, it may say Gadara, it may say Gergesa. So there's a lot of different reasons why this could be, whether this area is large and Mark is speaking as if it's just kind of in a generic term. Because if you go exactly to Gerasa, the lands of the Gerasenes there, you wouldn't necessarily be near the water, which is kind of important in this story. So there's some controversy there. A lot of it seems to be that things are just so closely worded with some of these words. They sound so similar that maybe it's been the flick of the wrist or flick of the pen or someone struggling to see that it's not a major controversy. There are those who I think used to it sometimes say, look, these locations aren't even the same. The Bible can't be trusted or it can't be true, and it's not the case. That there are a few ways, we're not going to get into them for lack of time tonight, but there are a few different explanations for simple reasons why Mark may record this as occurring in one place. Now Mark is, as the first source, kind of gets trusted the most, so we kind of roll with him on what it is and kind of think, kind of to roll with Matthew and Luke and think, why would they record a different area? And again, there's a few reasons for that: terminology, semantics. It's not a deal breaker, but we should know that it's clear that the events happened on the eastern shore of Galilee. You feel confident about that, in an area that was primarily inhabited by Gentiles. And that'll be important here in a second. So Jesus comes to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately he's met by someone. Who meets him when he steps out of the boat? Yeah, a possessed man, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the disciples who Jesus just asked, are you still afraid? He actually takes them to a place where, as good Jewish boys, they would be quite afraid. They're going into a Gentile country. They're going into the tombs where they weren't allowed to be. It's kind of unclean. And yeah, there's this zombie-like person who lives there too. Like, this is a terrifying event for them. And Jesus says, if you don't yet believe, let me take you here. And so that's where he takes them. So we see this demoniac, as many of the gospel writers will refer to him, or any of our translations refer to him. And what does the scripture say he is like?
Super strong and crazy.
Super strong and crazy.
Yeah.
Violent.
Violent.
Cut up.
Yeah, he's harms himself, hurts himself. Violent towards himself. Other gospel want to make sure, let us know that he wasn't clothed, right? They attempted to bind him in chains, and he broke those. Tried to bind him in shackles, he broke those. So an unclean. So he lived among the tombs. He's been chased out of town, obviously. Luke tells us he was naked, he could not be bound, he broke chains and shackles, and night and day he cried out and cut himself with stones. What Mark is trying to do, I think, he's trying to give us a glimpse, trying to tell us, like, this is an extreme example of a ruined life. And he seems to be suffering immensely more than some of the other possessed folks we've seen in previous encounters. Like, we've already seen people who are possessed, who have demonic forces over them or in them, but yet he seems like his suffering is much more intense. And the answer, I think, when we say, well, why is this so much more intense, comes in to play when Jesus asks him his name, right? When Jesus asks him his name, what does he say?
Legion.
Yeah, he says, Legion, for we are many. So legion was a military term designed or designated, used to describe Roman armies, anywhere, any group, a size grouping, anywhere between 3,000 and 6,000. So there's a slew, it seems like. Not necessarily has to be one of those numbers, but it's a large number of demons who seem to be occupying and attacking this man. Matthew 12 says this. Jesus is teaching, and there's a lot going on in this verse, so we just want to focus on one part of it. But he says, when the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So also it will be with this evil generation. A lot going on in that text, but what we want to focus on is the fact that more demons means more suffering. The more demons you have, the more worse your condition is, and that's kind of what's going on with this legion, right? So legion is a name for many, but I think it also wants us to denote, because we think of legion in military terms, that there's a spiritual battle going on here, right? Like it harkens all the way back to Genesis 3, in the tension that Jesus said would always exist between his offspring and Satan, and that's on display here, again, here in Mark 5, that here's this battle between Jesus and the powers of evil, Jesus, the kingdom of God, opposing this army of evil. And Legion recognizes Jesus, right? As we've seen before, Legion falls right down before Jesus. He acknowledges him as the Son of God. He begs for mercy. And that's kind of something we've already seen in some similar stories. And from the get-go, Legion is in complete submission to Jesus. They're aware of his power. They're aware of his authority. And Legion makes an unusual request of Jesus. After he's begged him to have mercy, he's asked him about kind of the timing. He makes it, we'll stop. Let's not get too far ahead. But he asked Jesus an unusual request. What does he ask them to? He said he begs him not to be sent out of the country, but rather into some pigs nearby. Now, many translations will record that Legion's request was, don't cast us out of the country. Does anybody else's Bible say anything different?
Not to send them out of the country.
There are a few translations. If you have a dynamic translation, which instead of trying to capture word for word, a dynamic translation will try and capture the meaning, it might say, don't cast us into the abyss. The demons seem to have this understanding that there is an appointed time when Jesus will destroy them. More specifically, it seems they have an awareness of what we know as his second coming, but not his first. And we see this with the demons, and we see this with a lot of the people Jesus encounters, specifically the Jews, where they're very confused about his first coming. It's a mystery, the purpose thereof. But even though it was foretold in the Old Testament people, Jews, and now the demons, they were unaware of it until Jesus showed up and began to fulfill it. Yes?
Is that at the basis of, like in verse 7, where he says, like, he actually invokes, hey, by God, you know, but he says, like, do not torment me?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the part that is like, don't send me into the abyss?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, so I think that, there's their awareness of that sequence of events that we see happen in Revelation 9 or Revelation 20, either one, occurring. And we talked a little bit last week about, Jesus kind of used that metaphor about you can't, enter into a man's house and plunder him until you bound him. And it's kind of like we all see all this demonic activity. It's almost as Jesus is slowly binding the man, so to speak. And this is, I think, kind of, they're familiar. That's what they kind of get at in verse 7. And then this, don't cast us out. Some people will look at that and say, well, demons are assigned geographic locations, and they thought they were doing pretty well in that location, and they want to be cast out of there, and that's what, yeah, potentially, maybe. But I think in addition to that, or alongside of that at least, there's this reference to, we know there's an appointed time where you'll end us forever. Is that time now? We don't want, obviously they don't want that now. But we'll hit on that a little bit here in a second. So back to the request, because it is unusual. Don't send us out. Don't send us into the abyss. Don't send us out of the country. Don't kill us. Like those, we get. You're facing something that's so much greater than you, and you know you're going against their will. It's normal to beg for mercy. But the request to go in the pigs is kind of an unusual one, right? And I think there's, the Bible says 2,000 pigs on the hillside, right? I think there's equally the same amount of opinions on what they mean. If you read commentaries, or you go to YouTube, or you were to Google it, like you can find 2,000 different opinions on the significance of the pigs and what do they mean. And it's interesting because it's like, well, it's tucked in there right next to the parables, and we just spent all last week being like, there's probably meaning in every bit of this parable, and most of the parables there was, but we're not in a parable anymore, so it's like, is there significance? And there's a few different opinions. We can explore some of them, why Jesus would consider sending them into the pigs. Some will say the demons have to have a host, so he had to send them into something, and it's like, I don't necessarily know that I see that in Scripture per se. Others will say, well, the Jews shouldn't have been raising pigs anyway and making a profit off unclean animals, so that's why Jesus killed them. I've heard that one a ton. But this is a Gentile area. We're pretty confident in the way that they... So like one of the ways we know that, just through the text, we want to look for clues in the text, right? The way that they recognize or speak of Jesus, let me see what verse it is. So as the demons kind of take on the personality of those around him, they in verse 7, they say, what do you have you do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Anytime Son of the Most High God is used in the Old Testament, it's of a non-Jewish person recognizing who God is. So it's one of the clues that we have there. And so I don't think it's necessarily an indictment on any Jewish people who might have been there. Some say it's just an indictment on the fact that they're unclean. I don't know that we necessarily... they are unclean animals, but I don't know that... I don't know that Jesus took it out on them just for that reason. So I've heard that one a lot of bit. One option is that the whole agenda for demons is to cause trouble, just wherever, whenever, and however. This was the quickest solution they thought of, and this certainly would have and did cause an issue in the town. This is obviously a lot of money running down the hill into the water, and somebody's going to lose it, right? There's another view, I think, commonly held about this passage that I think does kind of bear a lot of weight, that there's a lot of tradition that says that he's not just throwing the demons into pigs for any old reason, but he's actually overthrowing the god of this region. That there's a tradition that says that as Gentiles, they worship the pagan god, and the way that their animal of choice, their sacrifice, was a pig, and that they actually... to pay homage to that god or to worship that god, they would throw a pig off a cliff in sacrifice. And Jesus is kind of like, you throw all of the pigs and kind of just overturn everything. And that I could see that for sure. So whether it's the most likely explanation, I think the one that we know we can really lean into, though, that is trustworthy, is that, demons are demons, and they love to kill, and they love to cause problems, and they love to cause tension, especially between Jesus and people. So that's probably the largest motivation. And we know that it caused... Now, do we know that it caused tension in the town?
Yeah.
Yeah, how do we know that?
They told him to get out.
Yeah, so what was the reaction to Jesus' miracle? So Jesus heals this man, and then the herdsmen go and tell what happened. You know, that Jesus cast this demon out of this man, and then all of our pigs took off and killed themselves. this is where we're at. And the people come from the town, and this is their first encounter with Jesus, and their response is what?
Get out of here.
Please go, please
Yeah,
go.
they see the man clothed in his right mind, and they beg him to leave. And as we've said before, Mark is continually showing us how people respond to Jesus, and there are lots of different ways on display in Mark chapter 4 and 5 and 6. The reactions or responses typically follow some sort of you have one of these demonstrative acts that Jesus does of power and authority. And we have that here. And then when the townspeople see Legion, although he's not Legion anymore, we don't get a new name for him, but he's clothed and he's sitting in his right mind, their response is they're frightened, right? So they're afraid. They're fearful. But which is not necessarily a bad thing. But then instead of, exploring that further or stepping into that or examining it, they immediately request Jesus to leave. Kind of like, hey, what you did is amazing, but you did it and we want no part of it. So whether they look at this and they're upset, most people I think will hold to the tradition. It's kind of like they were upset that Jesus killed all their pigs and they lost a lot of livelihood from this, or he offended their God and now they're upset with him. Others are just like, we don't know who you are, but this is sorcery. We just want you out of our region, something like that. But nevertheless, they want him to leave.
If you can do that to pigs, what could you do to me?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Jesus obliges, right? Yes.
I have, the way it's described here, it says, Jesus gave them permission
Yeah.
to leave. Which is not the typical way that it's described, I mean, his miracles are described. So do you have an opinion about why it says that? I mean, to me, it's like he's not casting them out. He's saying, I'm going to cast you. If you want to go there, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, both things are true there. Jesus definitely, I think, casts them out. Mm-hmm. But he gives her permission instead of meeting the end that the other forces of evil that Jesus had cast out, whether that was the abyss or whatnot. He gives them the option, like, you can go into the swine instead.
It's going to happen no matter what. So if you want to go there, that's fine. Either way, you're not going to make it.
Yeah, and that is a significant, that is a theme throughout Scripture, is that the forces of evil and Satan, they can only do so far as what God permits them to do.
Okay,
So
that makes sense.
So their response is, we're afraid and want you to leave. And Legion, or not Legion, I don't know what to call him now, not Legion, that's not what he wants to happen, right? Well, he's fine with Jesus going, but he wants to go with him, right? And it's always interesting to see, okay, what instructions does Jesus give the healed person? And most of the time we've seen so far is, don't tell anyone. And that's not the instructions that not Legion gets, right? Jesus commands the man, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has mercy on you. And again, that's odd in the backdrop compared to so many of the stories we've seen already. And it begs the question, why does this man get to tell everyone what God has done for him, but others are asked to be silent? Any guesses?
I was asking that question myself, but I feel like it's too much has happened and too many people know now that it's almost impossible for him to not, because there's so many people coming to see him that he has to get on a boat to get away from them. There's so many people, so it's like there's no putting a lid on this anymore, type of thing.
I think
out of the bag.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that, especially when we see
bag.
Yeah, there's some truth in that, because his testimony is going to kind of turn the capitalists upside down. Yeah, Abby?
I think it has to just do with the social setting of where he is,
Yeah.
whether or not people are gonna react aggressively, or if they'll be like, oh, okay, cool, or just whatever kind of deal.
Yeah. I think
The
the
Gentiles
social,
threatened to kill him.
right.
I mean, the people who wanted Jesus dead from early in the book of Mark were the religious leaders of the Jews, right? And we're not in a predominantly Jewish area, so when Jesus keeps saying it wasn't his time yet. I don't know if that's in Mark or more in some of the other Gospels. That was until he started proceeding toward Jerusalem, and then all of a sudden he wasn't saying keep it on the DL anyway. This wasn't a situation where the word getting out was going to lead to the leaders coming at him early.
Yeah, it's, do I see that hand? Do I see hands?
I kind of thought that because he wanted to go with Jesus and Jesus said, oh no, that he kind of gave him a project, you know, like,
Yeah.
here's something you can do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not gonna bring you with me, but you can tell your family.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, Paul gets a lot of credit for being the first missionary to the Gentiles, but it was likely not Legion.
It was Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider was the first.
The only thing I was gonna say is that the other place where in Mark so far is in the first chapter where he heals that leper.
Mhm.
And even though he says like, don't tell anybody, he does say, go show yourself to the priests,
Yeah.
right? And so it was kind of like, don't tell most people, but like, go show yourself to the priests and,
Yeah.
you know, make the offerings and stuff. So I'm just wondering if there's something there, like there's go tell the people who are just like least likely to believe you almost. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's just one answer here,
Yeah.
but when you consider the context, the whole command is ridiculous, right? When was the last time this guy went home? When was the last time this guy saw a friend?
Yeah.
It's like Jesus is like, there are going to be people who want to talk to you, want you to deal with them first. It is definitely on the radar. And as Brian was saying, maybe the biggest thing is like, there's not a threat here. Like Jesus is kind of keeping his ministry in Jewish areas kind of on the down low, so not to speed up his trial and arrest. There are folks who want to kill him. And he understands that like, hey, everything that he's saying and doing won't come to full light until after he is crucified and resurrected. So he's kind of patient amongst them and kind of lays low. But there's not a threat here. There's this group of Gentiles isn't going to try and overthrow the Roman government based on what Jesus has done here. They're not going to plan evil against him. They're not going to try and push him off a cliff. But yeah, as we also said, there's also an announcement to be made, like the gospel, the message of the kingdom is coming to the Gentiles. And we get this sneak preview of it here through this healed man. And again, if Mark is going to answer this question, who is this Jesus? It's clear here that Jesus is demonstrating his deity, right? Like we just saw. I was going to draw a chart. I decided not to, but I mean, we can kind of go through, you know, what we've seen so far. We started with creation, like he calmed that storm, and then now we're at a spot where he's we see him over the forces of evil or demonic activity, and he's showing that he has power over that. And then we kind of get to another story where Jesus is going to show his power over a couple more things. Wow. And you kind of got these, just remember, those disciples are still there kind of wrestling with that faith over fear mentality, right? So they do get to leave the place they were probably terrified to be anyway. In Mark 5 and, is it 20 or 21? 21, it says they crossed back. Jesus does a lot of boat work, right? A lot of back and forth. And they cross back into the boat to the other side, and as soon as he gets to the other side, he's met by a great crowd, right? And last week we discussed briefly kind of this literary device that Mark uses. I think we called it a Markan sandwich, right? Does anyone remember what that is? We've seen it once. We'll see it again with the parable of the fig tree later on in next semester. It's kind of this attention-getting tool that Mark uses to make a point, where he starts a story, bread, interrupts that story, meat, and then comes back and finishes that story, other slice of bread. That's why it's often called a Markan sandwich. And we see this in verses 21 through 43, so we kind of want to pay attention to it. We'll put a pin in it for now. We'll come back and kind of examine maybe why he wanted us to, why he didn't tell these stories separately, but instead used this sandwich motif, and ask what he wanted us to see later. But Jesus enters the ship following this casting out of Legion. They ask him to leave. Jesus typically obliges that request. And he comes out of the other side, and immediately he gets out the boat again, and he's met with a large crowd. But amid all these people swarming Jesus, we're told of two in particular with whom Jesus has an interaction. Who are they? Who's the first one?
Jairus or Jairus or
Jairus.
Jairus.
Could be any of them. Yeah, we don't know. Yeah. And who's the second one?
A woman.
A woman. We're not given her name, but we know that she has a severe medical issue that she's been dealing with for years. Growing up in the church, I always heard her referred to as the woman with the issue of blood. I don't know if you heard anything differently, but that's what we know. And Jairus comes down, and he falls down at Jesus' feet immediately, and he begs him to come and heal his sick daughter, who is at the point of death. And meanwhile, this other woman that we'll be introduced to in a second is kind of just lurking in the crowd, watching and waiting and hoping for a moment to be able to sneak into Jesus' presence unnoticed. And before we get into kind of the heart of their story, one of the things we talked about, I think, in the homework, at least I hope we did, I don't remember, but we talk about why it was risky for both of them to approach Jesus in the way they did. So let's talk about Jairus first. He's only mentioned by name one time, I think, in the beginning. And then after that, Mark and the other writers start calling him ruler, a ruler of the synagogue. They're kind of highlighting the risk, I think, involved. But in Jesus' time, synagogues were led by a small group of laymen who were responsible for conducting services. And these officials were chosen by the members of the local synagogue. So he's a religious leader of the Jewish contingency who's elected by his fellow synagogue members, right? So given what we know that entails, what makes it such a risk for him to approach Jesus?
He could
Abby?
lose his job.
Well, socially, like, Jesus isn't like a favored person, and then if his daughter is sick and he's being like in the house of a sick person, he's considered like unclean.
Yeah.
So to like break a rule, I think they're laid out in Leviticus, I don't know. Like to break a rule as like a synagogue leader, like you're kind of saying like, oh, like you're either above the rule or you disregard the rule kind of deal.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
It's a political position too, so voted out just as quickly as he's voted in.
Yeah.
That wouldn't.
Yeah. Mary, I think you said it was his job. You know, he could
Yeah.
lose his job. A synagogue leader running to Jesus at this time that we know is very tense. When there was so much tension between Jesus and the Jews would be a bad look. Like he could have lost his job. He could have lost his reputation. He could have lost, his closest friends are probably members of the synagogue. The reason he has the home he has, or the wealth he has, or the power he has is all wrapped up in his position. But nevertheless, he doesn't just inquire about Jesus. He doesn't send one of his servants, and we know he has some, to go, will you go fetch Jesus? No, he runs up to him on his own and bows down before him, kneels down before him. Let's talk about the woman and the risk involved in her approaching Jesus, even though we haven't gotten to that portion of the story yet. But I know that you guys have already worked through the text, so this isn't a spoiler, but she also approaches Jesus. This woman had an issue of blood. Most people that I've read over the years have always said it's some type of hemorrhage. Though it's not stated explicitly, it's likely she had a hemorrhage from her womb. Such a problem, according to the Old Testament law, renders her unclean. Anyone or anything she touches is likewise religiously contaminated. This means she's always and constantly ceremonially unclean. That means she's unfit for the temple and for gatherings, for work. If this issue, we don't know. We know she's had it for 12 years. We don't know when it began. If it began around 12 or 13, she may have been had not been fit for marriage. It's likely or possible that she was never married, and she would have to make it loud and clear anytime she went a place that she was unclean, so no one would accidentally come in contact with her. I mean, what risks is she taking?
And here she is in a crowd trying to push her way through to be able to.
Yeah.
She can get stoned.
Yeah.
They could have done some bad things.
Yeah.
Well, and the humiliation too, I mean, just of being caught. She
Yeah.
took a lot of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't talk much about, I remember my seventh, it's such a small, probably silly example, but I remember like, my mom made me go donate blood on my 17th birthday. Like, that's what we're gonna do for fun. And I was woozy after. And imagine having an issue of running blood for 12. I mean, you're physically exhausted and feeble and so weak. Again, yeah, the crowd. She's obviously risking making others unclean, including this rabbi that's come to visit town, because she knows she has got to enter intent to touch him and his garment. But we'll find out and see later that that's not a big deal for Jesus. Records of the treatment prescribed. So the Talmud, which is kind of this Jewish collecting of sayings and writings and history, it's not very nice to doctors. But it does record treatments for some of these conditions. And some of the things that it records kind of illustrates the fairness of the statement where it says that she'd suffered greatly under many doctors. Like, this wasn't try this shot or this pill, but this was drinking some just vile tasting concoctions that someone would mix together and doing some other strange acts to try and stop this disease. And likely none of them did any good except cost her money. So she'd been poked and prodded and experimented on by doctor after doctor, and she only got worse while losing all she had, trying to find a remedy. So when we look at these two individuals, what's the condition of both of them? Like, what's the condition they share here?
Desperation.
Yeah, absolutely. They are desperate. One is willing to lose all he has to get to Jesus. One's already lost everything, and this is kind of a last-ditch effort, right? They're literally both crawling on their hands and knees to get to Jesus because they believe he can restore, right? Not only desperation, although I think that's the biggest one, they're also very humble. There's a lot of humility here. And I think authentic faith is very humble, right? So Mark paints this picture that Jesus, and this ruler comes to Jesus, and he asks Jesus to come to his house and to heal his daughter. He's like, oh, I'll go with you. And as he's going, is the way Mark kind of tells us this occurs, the crowd is still pressed around, and the woman with the issue of blood kind of waits for the right moment and kind of gets through this crowd, convinced that if she might just touch the bottom of his garment, that she would be healed. And so she gets through the crowd, and she touches the hem of Jesus' robe, and immediately, Scripture says, immediately, that's one of Mark's favorite words, right? Immediately the blood is dried up, and she knew immediately her disease was gone. She wasn't the only one that knew that something happened immediately, right? That Jesus knew immediately. And it's probably very unlikely that he even felt a tug or that his movement was stopped in any way. But he felt, I think the other gospel is he felt the virtue go out. And the disciples think he's being crazy. Like, look at this crowd. We were talking about last week, a few weeks ago, like what the crowd would have been like in our terms, and we're talking about like concerts and different things. And the disciples thought he was nuts. It's crazy. I haven't got to watch much of it, but sometimes I see. My wife has watched The Chosen a lot, and I don't realize how much the disciples played the role of like bodyguard, at least in the way that they portray it. It probably likely was. They probably were doing a lot of work on like keeping people away, and they're just like, Jesus, how can you? What do you mean? Who touched you? And he talks about, I know that the power has gone out from me. And here's the thing. It probably didn't stop what he was doing. He probably didn't even feel necessarily the tug of his robe, but he stops anyway. Why would he stop? The miracle is over. This lady's been healed. Why would he stop and speak with her?
To commend her faith?
Would
Abby,
she,
commend her
like,
faith.
not have been able to speak to anyone, like, during the whole time she was unclean?
I mean, from a distance.
Yeah, so, like, would him, like, going to speak with her be kind of like a signal to the crowd, like? Restoring
dignity.
Yeah. I mean, even just Jesus also in other stories, speaking to a woman or speaking to a woman in one-on-one terms was pretty significant. But yeah, for someone who has been without community, and everyone wanted to be away from, and for someone to not only stop to speak with her, but to seek her out intentionally, yeah, that was huge. But he wanted to see who had such faith and commend her faith. Yeah, as Mary said, her faith should be an example, and it should be noted, and it should be celebrated. And stopping also makes it clear that it was her faith and putting her faith in Jesus and his power that healed. It wasn't just because he's a holy man and I touched his holy garment. That's not the case. But it's because specifically she believed Jesus even if I just got this close to him, could heal me.
He also gave her the chance to be open and honest about it,
Mhm.
right? She lied, but like it kind of proved the genuineness of her faith when she came forward and kind of like just submitted herself to whatever the consequences might be.
Yeah. And it's also very significant, I think, too, that, you know, Jesus is leaving. We don't, this town, we don't know if she is. So I think it's very important, if she's staying, that people in the crowd get to see that Jesus does not condemn her. Like, how could he touch me now? I'm ceremonially unclean. Like, no. But he looks at her, and she begins to tremble, right? She's scared to death. She falls down in fear and trembling, and she confesses immediately, here's what I've done. And what's Jesus' response?
He healed of your afflictions.
Your faith has made you well.
Compassion.
He calls her daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he says, your faith has made you well, go in peace. And there, I mean, you talk about restoration. It's like this guy who lived in the caves all by himself, tormented by thousands of people, or thousands of spirits he didn't want to be tormented by. Jesus says, no, now you get to go home and be with friends. And now it's this person who's been excluded from all of life for 12 years, like, you're a daughter of God. We talked about Jesus expanding that kingdom community a few weeks ago, what it means to be a part of the family of God. And now he says, I can't imagine what that term of endearment coming from Jesus would mean to her. How much the kindness and the gentleness and the grace would mean to someone who lived so long in her condition. Not only was she seen, but someone sought her out. But it's Mark. So before we can even relish the sweetness of one story, he jumps back in, right? With the other slice of bread. He says in verse 35, as Jairus is sitting and watching, concerned for his own daughter, he sees Jesus stop in delay so he can speak to this other woman and call her daughter. And while he's speaking to this woman, someone from Jairus' house comes and says, hey, you don't need to trouble the teacher anymore. She's already passed. And what does Jesus tell Jairus in light of this news? Don't be afraid, only believe. So again, the disciples are getting this eyewitness account of what it looks like to have faith over fear. And so they go on, and Jesus approaches the house, right? And what do they find when they get to Jairus' house? Like, is it quiet? No. So Jairus is popular, and he also has hired help, and there are professional mourners who would come around when someone passed away, and they'd be playing their dirges or whatever they would play, and they'd be mourning, and it would be loud. And Jesus comes and he sees that crowd, and he kind of sends them away, right? So this was not a miracle that everyone got to watch, right? Like we get the notion that it's just Peter, James, and John, and then the girl's mom and dad. Everybody else is kind of moved out. And he kicks out all the folks in Jairus' house. In verse 39, he says, why are you making a commotion and weeping? He said, the child isn't dead, but only sleeping. And then that's when all the folks in the house laugh at him, which he responds by kicking them out, which I think is appropriate. And this is one of two occasions where Jesus calls someone who's dead asleep. The other is in John 11 with Lazarus. In both cases, Jesus shows up tardy after someone has died and raises them back to life. In both cases, he says they're sleeping, and then he wakes them up. And it's just this kind of awesome little side principle that because of Jesus, followers of him can look at death, which we probably would look at as life's greatest enemy, as merely a nap. It's so awesome to think about that. But then he gets to verse 40, and he says, when the crowd around the home hears Jesus say she's only sleeping, they laugh at him, so in return he kicks them out. He takes the girl's father and mother into where the child was. Because of the connection where the woman had the issue of blood for 12 years, and this girl is 12 years old, there are some people who will try and present a case that the woman that Jesus healed with the issue of blood was this girl's mother, and that she started hemorrhaging when she gave birth, and that it never stopped, and she was put out of the house, and now she returned. But I don't know that you can get that from here, because it looks like Jesus is saying her mother's already on the scene, where that woman's not there and present. But
Bit of a stretch.
it is a bit of a stretch, but you might hear that and want you to be aware of it. I don't know that you can prove it, but if anyone would like to look more into it and shock us all next week with proof, we're open to it. So, but anyway, he kicks them out. You got the father and the mother, and then we believe Peter, James, and John to be there because that's where Mark gets the story from. Jesus comes in and he takes the girl by the hand, and he says to her, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. Some translations may say damsel. Some may say little lamb, arise. It's a term of affection and tenderness coming from Jesus' voice. And she gets up. They make a point to tell her that she got up and walked because she was 12 years old. She gets up and she walks. And Jesus, what's his command to, and they all marvel in amazement, and then what's his command in this situation with this miracle to Jairus and his family, wife?
No one should know.
Don't tell anybody. And feed her. That was the instruction. Don't tell anyone and get her a sandwich, which is kind of unusual. You begin to read scripture though, and you're like, it does really seem like eating was kind of this proof of life. Like this isn't a ghost. This is, you think about Jesus when he's raised and he finds the disciples on the shore. Like he starts cooking breakfast and they eat together. Or on the road to Emmaus, he shares a meal. When they gets back to the house, and it's like this seems to be this proof of life. Like it's like, this isn't a spirit. This isn't something that I'm dreaming. Like this is real. This is really happening. This is one of the reasons. Also, it's very likely that they record this because at some point in her illness, whatever it was, she probably became bedridden and hadn't walked for some time. So it's a very miraculous thing that she began to get up and walk. She's not walking and she's laying in bed. It's a good chance she hadn't eaten in a long time. And that was part of the reason that she potentially passed away. And now this is all restored. Again, Jesus' command here, in light of what we talked about earlier with the Gentile miracle, here it would be a little bit more risky for this to be publicized. The teacher from Nazareth or the teacher of Galilee had raised my daughter from the dead. Like, yeah, that's a little different. So anyway, it's interesting again to note that Mark uses this literary device. Why interrupt the story of Jairus' daughter for the story of the woman with the issue of blood? And someone will say, well, that's just the way the story progressed. And I think that's true too, but Mark wasn't bound. He could have told these stories separately, but I think from the outside looking in, one thing to recognize is that these two individuals at the beginning of this story, in the days leading up to this encounter with Jesus, could not have been further apart on the social spectrum, right? Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood, right? They could not have lived more different lives. That Jairus is likely a wealthy man, a man of means, a man of servants, and the woman has lost literally everything she has, including likely her chance to earn. Jairus is a man in the first century, which means who has power and authority. The woman is feeble and lowly, probably both physically and in spirit. That Jairus is free, that he can go places and he can do as he pleases. And the woman is bound. She's limited in all interactions and experiences, hindered by her illness in every manner, whether that's worship or work or social or relational, right? And if you didn't, I think, sandwich this in like that, it would kind of look like Jairus is getting preferential treatment because of who he is. And it's just like, no. He's like, when it really boils down to it, the ground is level. It's like, what level's the ground here? Well, it's their humanity, right? That regardless of how it appears, the reality is that they're both human, which means they're subject to suffering, which means they're inevitably going to encounter things that are too much for them. That means at some point, regardless of status or power or wealth, that as a person they're going to encounter in this fallen world, in our fallen state or in their fallen state, whether it's from nature, whether it's evil forces, whether it's disease, or whether it's death, something that there's going to come against something they can't take on themselves. And that's true for all people of all times and all places. So that goes back to that word, like they're all going to have moments of desperation. And it's like, what do we do when that happens? And again, it really levels out these two individuals. In their daily living, they were so different, but in their desperation, they're exactly the same. And they both come to Jesus in the exact same way. Humble faith. They both show humility. They both recognize Jesus' authority. They both exercise sincere faith and belief. If we were to kind of diagram, even if we just did like a story arc, like the action and conflict and resolution here, we'd see a lot of similar things in the stories, but a lot of differences. You have people who are desperate, whether it's the disciples in the boat, or the woman with her disease, or Jairus with his dying daughter, or the demoniac who's plagued by the demons. And then you've kind of got this common response where they come to Jesus and they take a risk, and everything kind of climaxes on what his response will be, and he heals folks, right? The difference comes in, what's the response of the crowd, and what's this response? And it's almost like we get to see the parable of the soils kind of unveiled before us, right? So we had some folks who responded by rejecting altogether. We had some who seemed distracted by the cares of the world, and we have some that seemed to take root and were accounted faith for some of these things. But I think when we look at this, and you could break it down in a lot of different ways, but we look and we ask the question, okay, who is this? Well, what has Jesus done to answer that question? Well, first he showed his power in the storm over what? His power over what? Nature, creation. And then with the demoniac, he showed his power over what?
Spiritual forces.
Yeah. And then with the woman with the issue of blood, he showed his power over what?
Human body and
Disease. And then with Jairus' daughter, he showed his power over what?
death.
Life and death.
What is Jesus trying to show by doing these things? Yeah.
His divinity.
Yeah. These are only things only God can do. Like this is gonna ring a bell. Like what's going on here? Like Jesus he's doing things that the psalmist said only God can do, and he's trying to firm the disciples up. And so that's kind of the two big things here that we're supposed to recognize, and that's what happens. That when Jesus exercises his authority, we see the power of Jesus on display, or we hear the message of the gospel about Jesus' power. What we're supposed to do is it demands a response, right? So we recognize Jesus' authority, but as real as it is, not everyone responded the same way, right? And Mark is building this case, right? Like, so he's building up in chapter 5, into chapter 4, chapter 5, like he's showing you like over and over and over again, look this is amazing. Look what Jesus is doing. Look at who he is. Look at his power. Look at his authority. And you get to chapter 6, and we're not going to jump ahead, but it's like, oh, so someone is going to make a really big confession coming off this, or someone's going to grow in their faith. And Mark is building up to a big result there, a big demonstration, or big exercise, big decision, I should say, or a big declaration, but it may not be what we think it is. But nevertheless, one of the things we encounter when we come to a passage like this is, whether or not we've responded well. I know many of us, if you're in this Bible study, you haven't flat out rejected, maybe like the townspeople around Legion. But it's not enough just to be afraid. It's not enough just to be amazed. But the proper response to Jesus' authority is this humble faith that we see in this passage, right? And we enter chapter 6, seeing if Jesus' closest family and friends back in his hometown will honor his authority and power with humble faith. Any questions about chapter 5?
Can you just repeat that last statement about it wasn't enough for them to?
Yeah, so if we tallied up the responses, it wasn't enough for them just to be amazed. It wasn't enough for them to be afraid. They had to exercise, the proper response to Jesus' authority is humble faith, right? Any questions about chapter 5? Again, I think Eric said a few weeks ago, I like the way he said it. Mark, sometimes he feels like he's writing without taking a breath. There's no wasted words. Like this passage felt like we were going 75 miles an hour the whole time. Is there anything in there that we didn't hit on or miss?
The demons like invoking or appealing to God, that word was weird, and I never really noticed it before.
in verse,
A juror.
Legion, yeah, a juror.
Mine said beg.
in verse 10, he begged them earnestly not to send them out of the country. That one?
No, what was the actual word? Unless I misread it. I stared at it for a minute.
Implore you
Verse 7 again.
by God.
I adjure you by God. He's like invoking, like in the name of God.
Yeah.
Like, did they know it wasn't their time yet? And so he didn't have the option. Like, I don't know. I don't know what that word
to
meant.
me, they're just playing by the highest.
Yeah, swear to God.
But they also knew he was.
Right.
So I'm like, I don't totally understand it. I don't know. It's a weird wording, and I'd never really thought about it before.
Well,
I
that's a
just
good
wonder how
question.
he got 6,000 or 3,000 demons. You know, what was he doing that they all entered his life? I mean, was he,
No.
you
We
know?
don't know.
Listen, being a believer, I know that's not gonna happen to me, but you're just like, that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's strange to me that Jesus shows up and this happens other places too, but like a guy with all these demons that, Mark reports, he runs towards Jesus. Like
Yeah.
as compared to away from, right? Like if you're the demons and you're gonna go and then, the demons bring this guy up and he falls on his knees, in total submission, it's just striking to me that the demons
Yeah.
run this guy towards
Yeah.
Jesus and just like not bugging out. But maybe they wanted to stay in the country, I guess. So,
I've heard of many stories of missionaries that come into a place where there's like witches and different type of demonic powers in play in other countries, obviously, but they come up to them, the missionaries, because they want to show their authority in the area. Now, it's reversed here, they're coming up in submission to the authority here. And so I always thought that was really interesting. I was talking about that earlier, is that this visual aid of the demons bowing down in authority. Like they recognize the authority immediately, and then the missionary stories of they're coming up and be like, don't come here, we're in control here, that kind of stuff, and how that authority is reversed in the sense where they're like, you have no authority here. Well, actually we do, But anyways, you know what I mean? So I just thought that was really interesting to see that contrast of the authority position that all three of them had when they witnessed God and they bowed down before him. And even because I thought the same thing, why would the demons run towards him?
Yeah. I wondered the same thing too. Just is this a situation where they've been cast out? So if they see anybody, they approach them. I don't know if this is where we don't get it in writing, but Jesus called them forward. In chapter 6, the disciples are going to have to encounter on their own for the first time. Because that's what
I always wondered what happened to them after they were in the pigs and the pigs died. I've always wondered that, like, why go into the pigs and then he says, and then to
Just
the water to
immediately.
die, and where'd they go after that? Did they end up in the abyss automatically, or?
There's still about 1,995 opinions
Yeah.
on what the pigs do.
I haven't read that chapter of Piercing the Darkness yet, I guess.
Next week. There's a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot going on. We're skipping all over. Like Mark is one way, and then we get to the next section, and we're somewhere else, and we're hopping all around all over the place. We're seeing more demonstrative acts of Jesus' deity. So we got a lot to explore next week. So looking forward to it. Should be lots of good discussion. Lots of good time. I love this chapter 5, because it's mostly stories, and we can just kind of sit around, and just ask questions of the text, not necessarily read the stories and ask, what does this mean to you? But like, what does this mean for them, and what does it mean for us now? And I love how we all notice different things about the text, which is why I think this type of study is so much better in community. So thank you guys for your participation. I'm going to pray, and then we'll head out of here. Or we can stick around and we can explore.